record on computer.
Okay, welcome. Thank you for coming to reset mental health after the pandemic. I'm aware, seems like we're a small group right now, but I know also Victoria mentioned people might be coming in as we go, which is fine. This is also a short time period to cover mental health. So this is going to be, we're going to be pausing to really just focus on certain aspects of mental health. I'm hoping that really what this talk does is just open a conversation, whether it's a conversation among you and the Morse community, or you in your own household, or just a chance for you yourself to pause and reflect and take a minute to think about your own mental health after and amidst these last couple of years. So it's really about just kind of pausing, thinking about mental health, and maybe rethinking kind of how you define mental health. So for starters, I am Tara Redepenning. I'm the clinical director and therapist at Looking Glass Counseling. So we're a group counseling practice with locations in Somerville, Medford, and now because of the pandemic, we also have a fully staffed telehealth team. Additionally, I am a mother to kindergartner Grace Goulet, who is newly 6 and a half, and a half is very, very important. So I'm happy to be with you. And for starters, I just want to take a second and have you think about what comes to mind when you hear mental health, what your sort of immediate reaction is when someone brings up mental health, what you associate mental health with. And I ask because, at least in terms of how I grew up and my family of origin, despite everyone being well-intentioned about taking care of your mental health, it wasn't something we talked about unless something was wrong. So mental health really only came up when someone was feeling poorly, when someone was feeling sad or having a lot of emotion or seemed very angry. Then we spoke about mental health. The other thing I notice doing what I do is that there's a fair amount of binary thinking about mental health. Now, Boston and this Cambridge area is probably an outlier to that, right? We're home to a lot of therapists and a lot of mental health workers. But if I'm talking to people who are not necessarily aligned with this field, I hear a lot of things around like, well, my mental health is good, or how is your mental health? My mental health is good. My mental health is bad. I also get a lot of responses of like, oh, it's so nice you work in mental health. I really believe in mental health. It's not something I need, but mental health is really important, right? And I think it's important to shift our thinking about mental health from kind of a binary, it's good, it's bad, to really looking at the difference between mental health and mental illness. Because mental health is your general state of well-being, and it's something that needs to be looked after and thought about all the time, in the same way you think and we learn about our physical health. And the two are very much connected and dependent upon each other. Mental illness is something that disrupts your mental state and interrupts how you're feeling, thinking, communicating, and behaving. So mental health and thinking about your mental health doesn't necessarily mean you are experiencing depression or that you have a clinical mental health diagnosis. Mental health is really referring to how we take care of our entire well-being. So I like this definition, which is mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. So again, despite good intentions, at least the way I was raised, mental health wasn't something that was being talked about in schools the same way my kindergartner is already coming home talking about mindful breathing and naming her feelings, right? So I think already we're in a culture that does do a better job of this. But I think we can all spend more time just pausing to remember that our mental health is so much more than just how we're feeling emotionally on any given day. I think it's nice when thinking about mental health to really look at it like this pie chart, right? Which is that it's absolutely our emotions. Are we feeling sad? Are we feeling happy? Are we feeling angry? It's an important part. It's also our physical health. It's our social well being and whether or not we feel like we have a community of support. It's whether or not we're getting enough rest and whether our mental health is in enough shape that we can turn off for periods of the day from some of our worries. It's noticing and just paying attention to what our personal thoughts are and what our sort of inner narrative is throughout the day. And it's also healthy stimulation. It's play. It's getting to be in your body and enjoy things. In a way that I think we don't always encourage in adults the way we expect it from kids, right? But that all of these things make up mental health. So it's so much more than just feelings. We are hearing a lot more about it in the last couple of years. There's many more headlines about mental health, and usually those headlines are talking about depression and anxiety, which again, I think makes it easy to think of them as the same thing. So why are we hearing so much more about it? Well, there's a lot more people experiencing depression and anxiety since the pandemic. You can see this study. Pre-pandemic, 8.5% of US adults reported depressive symptoms, 28% in early 2020, up to 33% by 2021. So that's a huge increase in the number of people reporting feeling out of balance. And I can't predict what the exact number is going to be in 2022, but I will say I'm part of a group practice that has rapidly increased its number of providers in the last 2 years without shrinking our waiting list. So I think we probably have double the amount of providers right now and just as long, if not longer, a waiting list. So I'm not predicting that this number is going to decrease for 2022. And in that case, when you're thinking about those kinds of numbers, this is not just it's not just a physical health pandemic. We're really experiencing a mental health pandemic. And part of the reason for that, there's a number of reasons, but one thing I think it's important to reflect on is collective trauma that we have all and all are at the same time going through a trauma. And I'm aware that within mental health, trauma is a word people are using more frequently, and there's a lot of different things trauma can refer to. So I do want to name that I am really referring to it very intentionally and purposely here by its sort of definition. So I want to look at what collective trauma is, which is it describes the emotional and mental reactions to a devastating event that affects an entire group, country, or population. Fear, anxiety, grief, and depression are the most common symptoms of collective trauma. So the pandemic fits this in so many ways, right? It's not that many times, I hope, in our lifetime that we are going through something that is completely life-changing and totally disorienting, and everyone in the world is going through it with us. And while there can be community in that, it also means there hasn't been as many safe harbors during the last few years. We're not sure who we can go to and talk about these things. And often we feel like we shouldn't be talking about them because someone else always has it worse. So it's important to note we have all been and are all continuing to go through a trauma. And among the things trauma does is it puts us in our fight or flight response. And fight or flight, when we think about it, right, is really, if you break it down, it's simply our body's stress response. And it's our body doing exactly what it's supposed to do when we're perceiving a threat. And it's activating us to either run away or fight, or in some cases freeze. But it's shutting us down. It's having us hyper focused on survival. And we know that when we're in fight or flight, our frontal lobe goes offline. Our frontal lobe goes offline, and we have less access to our higher levels of thinking, our higher levels of communicating. Fight or flight, the purpose of fight or flight on an evolutionary, purpose was to be brief, right? It's to outrun the predator, it's to get to the prey, it's to win the fight. It's not a response we're actually supposed to be in for 2 years, right? And when you are in it for that long, it turns into chronic stress. And chronic stress changes the way your brain is functioning, and it changes the way your entire body is functioning. So as a therapist, when I'm thinking about fight or flight, I'm not just thinking of like, okay, someone's been in a trauma, someone's activated, but I'm also trying to hold the amount of things that are happening to that person in their body when they're in fight or flight. The body really does a really good job of taking everything but your immediate survival and putting it on the back burner, which means it's quickening your breath, your heart is pounding, your muscles tense, your digestion is slowing down, you're sweating more, you're releasing hormones. And all of these things in the moment are helping us to do what we need to do to survive. But when we're living like that, when we're losing our access, right, to calm, to a more regulated nervous system, we also lose our access to our coping skills, to our ability to think our way out of situations, to our ability to really pause and respond versus just react. And among the many problems, right, with the pandemic is, at least in the beginning, I hoped for that announcement where people would come and say, like, it's an all clear, right? You can return to life as you know it. You can take a breath. You survived this. And truthfully, our numbers with the pandemic are in a different place today than they were when I started putting this talk together a month ago, right? So even in those moments when our body gets to relax a little bit and say, oh, I'm safe now, there's something else that comes back up that activates us. So we're living in a very activated way, and we're surrounded by people who are living in an activated way, which leads to a lot of increased tension. We are also more isolated than we have ever been due to the pandemic. And I think it's important to remember, well, I want to say two things about isolation. One is that we crave social connection. That is something that our brain needs. Our body needs social connection. When we get to connect with other people, our brain releases the sort of hormones that calm us down during fight or flight. So not only are we in a more activated state, we have less access to the kind of connection that calms us down and re-regulates us. And while I think there are ways I certainly feel like I've become less isolated since I've been vaccinated, since my 5-year-old has, or my 6.5-year-old has been vaccinated, I'm also thinking a lot. I was just with my sister whose kids are 5. He just turned 5, so can get vaccinated. And her other little boy is 2.5. Right? They're in many ways, they're still living the way they lived in early 2020 because they fear what it's like. And I think in some ways it's harder to do those things right now when so many people around you in the world are able to sort of go back to the life as they knew it, or at least a semblance of that. I also think a lot as the parent of someone who is immunocompromised, right? That even for everyone, once they're vaccinated, it is, there are people whose risks remain different, and this threat remains constant. So I think, I continue to hope that we continue to think about the fact that even when it's over for us in some way, whether we got it or we're vaccinated, that there are people out there for whom it's going to remain a bigger threat for a while. In addition to this isolation, to feeling incredibly stressed, we've had less access to coping skills. And I know we know that in the sort of obvious way. I mean, people were talking about not getting to go to coffee shops, not getting to go to gyms, not going on vacation, but it was smaller things too. It was the micro loss of coping skills. I think of the fact that for me, my work day would end and I would take the subway from Davis back to Central. And that would be my time to kind of end my work day, re-enter my house and sit down for dinner. And during the pandemic, I was incredibly lucky to get to keep working, to be working from inside my house, to keep my job. But it also meant, and still means, I work till 6:25. I walk out of my home office and straight to the dinner table, right? And so I'm losing even those 10 or 15 minutes during the day where I could be quiet, where I could reflect, where I could even notice what I'm feeling after I'm finishing a work day. So sort of looking at just those few examples, I feel like it's easy then to sort of reframe the question from like, is your mental health okay? And has your mental health been affected? To just kind of being aware for yourself and for everyone around you. it's a good moment to think about how has your mental health been affected by the pandemic? What have you lost? What have you had less access to? In which areas of your life are you really noticing what these last 2 years have done? And this can show up in a lot of ways. And again, we're a society and a culture that likes big expression of feelings before we really notice and pay attention. So, as we're talking about mental health and the pandemic, we're associating it with people being violent in a public place, people making, homicidal or suicidal threats in a public way, people being more verbally abusive, incidents of road rage. And I absolutely think that all of those things are symptoms of the toll this has taken on people's mental health. But I think the tricky thing with big gestures, right, is that that's not the only way it shows up. And often it's so much more nuanced, and it's nuanced to the point where people don't recognize it in themselves, right? So if we're only looking for the biggest expression of a feeling, we're missing a lot of the other things that are going on that are the warning signs. And we want to be actually catching things way before they get to road rage. So, what else can it look like? Trouble sleeping, trouble focusing. Something I've heard a lot in my work as people have started to try to reintegrate is this feeling of like, I know I'm lonely, I know I'm bored, I know I should get out of my house, but actually now I don't really feel like getting out of my house, and I don't know really what I would do if I got out of my house anyway. I'm worrying more, I'm less comfortable with people, I'm having physical responses to being around crowds. People are having a lot of different feelings and experiences, and the important thing to do, I think, is to think about what does it look like for you. So, and I think it can look a lot of different ways, and we certainly notice when we're feeling, red faced and angry. We notice if our eyes fill with tears, but I think it can be more subtle than that. I've certainly noticed that if I get to the end of the day and I feel like everyone around me is talking really loudly, and I really will think like, why is everyone speaking so loudly? Right? That's often my cue to be like, oh wow, I've taken too much in today, right? Like I'm so sensitive at this moment to even volume or tone of voice that says to me, okay, this is a good moment for me to think about what I'm bringing home from my work day and what I might need right now, so that I can feel like I'm in a calm and more grounded place. And in terms of thinking about what it looks like for you, this is when I really think about grounding. And I will say that in general, when I bring grounding up or breathing up in, initially with clients, like, and I get this, right? Like, you're finally getting in with a therapist, you've maybe been on a waiting list, and among the first things they suggest is like, are you taking deep breaths? I feel frustrated by that sometimes, right? And I do it, right? There's a reason we do it. There's a reason we prioritize this, is that if we don't take a moment to actively and intentionally re-enter our body, we don't have access to our frontal lobe, and we don't have access to the kind of information we need to really gain self-awareness and the kind of self-insight that can help us care for our mental health on a day-to-day basis. So I think grounding can be intimidating to people when they hear things like meditation or yoga. I certainly hear all the time, like, I tried meditation once, it doesn't work for me, I'm too nervous to try meditation. I think meditation has a huge amount of benefits, but I'm also not here to say that's the only way to ground. And people are busy. I'm busy, right? Maybe we want to do a 15-minute meditation, but it's not always accessible to us. These few things I've listed right here are. So one thing I like for those people who really feel like I've tried breathing and I don't want to do a breathing exercise is taking 30 to 45 seconds to engage with your senses, to sort of just pause wherever you are. Nobody knows you're doing it, and just think for a minute, what am I hearing? What am I seeing? What am I smelling? Is there something I can touch? What do I taste? And if you want to get advanced with it, to change something up with your senses in that moment, right? So to splash cold water on your face, to drink cold water, to chew a piece of gum, to smell something pleasant. Any of those things are giving you a moment to really exhale. And our exhale is what cues our parasympathetic nervous system to kick in, get us out of fight or flight, and let us feel safe enough to really think about not how we want to react to fear, but how we want to respond. Another one is box breathing, which I think is my go-to for people who are very resistant to breath work in general. Box breathing is a really short breath where you can breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, and hold for 4. And the idea is you are thinking of a box as you're doing this. So I'm going to invite you just for a moment, wherever you are, to kind of just get comfortable enough. And I'm just going to cue it for a couple of rounds and just see what it does to your body, right? So you're going to breathe in, and you're breathing in 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, in 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4. It's not going to change everything, but sometimes that moment of just getting to be quiet and feel safe in your own body is enough to change to how you're responding in the moment, right? And certainly, at least the way it was in our household, we were a pretty lucky household during the pandemic. You know, my husband and I both got to continue our jobs from home. We kept our daughter at home. She was getting to do special starts via the computer. That was about as lucky as people got, right? But it also meant there was really not even a time to catch breath, right? Like the micromanaging of the schedule meant everyone was busy every moment. And it made it very easy when tensions got high to sort of snap, speak a little loudly, say something, you know, that maybe you wouldn't have preferred to say. And I think just having 30 seconds can make a really big difference in how the rest of your day goes. If you're completely short on time or interest in either of those things, really just heaving a huge sigh before saying what's ever on your mind is going to cue your parasympathetic nervous system to come on board a little bit. Just really going before you respond, even if you're being asked 20 questions in a row and you sigh, just that act gives you a little more clarity. And so when you're in a grounded place, when you're able to feel safe, that's when you can sort of access and start to think about some of the other things that help and how they and what version of them really helps you, right? So some things that I think we all need to be doing, but can look different ways for all of us, is externalizing your feelings should happen in a couple different ways. But on one level, you want to be able to externalize your feelings to some people in your life who can and will really receive the nuance of your experience. Now, we all ask, how are you, many times a day, probably many more times a day than we're actually going to sit and listen to a full answer, right? And a full answer also isn't appropriate, right? Like, how are you is a part of speech. You know, the grocery store isn't necessarily a time to explain the toll the pandemic has taken on you, right? But you should have people in your life where you can say, how are you? Actually, kind of crappy. This has been a really rough day. Like, here's what, and when I say people, I think often we hear about a tribe. A tribe doesn't mean you have 15 to 20 people that you can tell these things to. A tribe is like 1 or 2, right? You don't need, you know, a neighborhood of people, but you need to know who your people are for those times when you really want to talk about how your day is. Who in your life will sit and listen when you really want to talk about the nuances, good and bad, of your experience? We need those people. And again, not a large club, but a couple trusted people. And sometimes I think that is the demand for therapy, is that we're so out of practice doing that with each other, really actually stopping and listening to the answer of how are you, that I think many people feel like therapy is the only place where they can give those details. And while I welcome being that person for people, I actually think if we can get in the practice of having a couple of people in our life who can help with that, everyone's mental health is going to be better. Journaling. So it doesn't have to be journaling, but I think you also want to have a practice where you can externalize your thoughts. I think preferably on paper, but you can type it on the computer. It doesn't have to be in beautiful handwriting in a beautiful notebook you're going to keep forever. It can be on post-it notes. But when you're having a day where you're feeling really flooded and everything is looking kind of negative, I think that's a really good moment to kind of mind dump. Let all those thoughts out onto paper and kind of look at them and then kind of see, oh, wow, some of these feel like they're an accurate description of this day. And some of these narratives sound like I'm really depressed, right? We want to distinguish between the facts and the stories we make up about what's going on. And I think externalizing our feelings is a really important way to do that. I'll state again, any one of these things, especially the importance of really tracking your thoughts and thinking about the narrative you're coming up with, is its own talk and something I could spend a lot more time on. But for the sake of tonight, I just sort of want to raise the point that we've all taken in more information than we can possibly process, and having a practice where you can dump some of it out and figure out which are the things I really need to bring to a friend or work on, and which are the things that are just the too much stuff I've taken in and I can leave it on the paper, is a really helpful way to take care of your overall mental health. Play. What's fun for you? What brings you joy, right? I visited my family briefly this weekend and sort of noticed that if I see my sister, who I've known forever, I fall into so some of the rhythms you fall into when you're 6 or 8 years old. And I play, we played a board game, we danced around, and I realized oh, that's something I've been missing. That's not something I've had time for, right? I think sometimes we prioritize, we're slow to prioritize the things that really just make us feel alive and silly and access a different part of our being. Connection. And this is when a lot of people talk about spirituality, which I think is such an important part of mental health and is so important to distinct that from religion. I'm not saying it has to be religion, but I'm speaking about spirituality and connection in being able to engage with anything that reminds you that the world extends beyond yourself, right? We're holding a lot. It can be hard, not because we're self-involved, but because there's a lot to be anxious about. It can be really hard to look beyond our immediate circumstance, and connecting, whether it's with nature, whether it's people who are coming together with shared beliefs, whether it's a volunteer organization, is a good reminder that some of our worries are in an immediate moment, and that moment, that there is life beyond that moment. And then again, rest, right? Which is not just sleep, but what gives you a sense of peace, right? What helps you turn off? For some people, it's a long walk. For some people, it's, television shows that they think they're embarrassed to admit the names of. For some, it's a combination, right? For some, it's reading. It can be any of those things, but it's important to know that rest isn't just the however many hours you sleep at night, but the things you find during your day that just give you a moment to remember that you are safe, that you are a full embodied being, and that there's a lot of world around you. And kind of coming near the end, kind of thinking about then how we're talking about our mental health. I'm assuming all of us here tonight are parents, right? So also creating an environment, our kids have been through a lot. So how are we creating an environment where kids can start to name and think about how they're feeling and how they're coping with the constant change of their environment? I think a really important thing we can do is model mental health positive behavior, which is just kind of narrating for your kids what you're doing for yourself, right? Like, yeah, I am feeling a little frustrated right now. I actually am going to take a moment to myself, right? Or, yeah, I'm actually not going to be on your play date. You're going to be going with your dad or the co-parent, and I'm going to be doing something else because it's actually really good for me to get to engage with some of my friends. It's helping them start to be aware of mental health the same way we say, like, wash your hands to protect from germs. We want to be sort of introducing daily, easy to access things that remind them that mental health is important too. So being mindful of your own habits and your own self-talk. I say this to people all the time, and I'm still shocked by some of the things I say, like when I can't find my keys, when I can't find my phone, right? Like, is your response like, oh, I can't find my phone, I'm going to look for it? Or is it more like mine, which is often like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was this stupid. How did I do this? I'm so annoyed, right? Like, that again is sort of showing something that we don't want our kids to pick up about how we're coping with small moments. And then I think not talking about emotions only when you see big emotions, but talking about a lot of different emotions at a lot of different times, right? So I think there's a lot of, and I think it's great that we're helping kids connect what their behavior is with what they might be feeling internally. But I think there's a lot more focus of, you seem angry or you seem upset. We aren't really calling out moments of like, you seem really well regulated, or that activity seems to make you seem really peaceful. It seems like you're really happy when you do this. Or I notice when you play this game, you have a lot of energy in your body, but when you're doing this activity, it really seems like you are breathing a little slower and you're a little calmer. I'm not saying you're doing that 24/7, but helping kids connect with emotions and not just the big expression of emotion is so important. And among that is by letting them know what you're feeling and how you're doing when that's appropriate. It isn't always. Um, Modeling and teaching ways that kids can externalize thoughts and feelings, like, hey, let's try doing art together. Let's sit down and write together. Do you want to build for a while? And then helping them see, like, oh, it really seems like when you did this, you were able to. And noting for yourself the activities that free your child up enough that they can tell you a little bit more of your day. I'm certainly already discovering, even in the kindergarten year, which are the things that are like, once we're doing them for a little bit, she's suddenly pretty talkative and feels safe. I'm noticing that if I'm driving and she's in the back seat and we've been driving for about 10 minutes, that's when they'll suddenly be like, hey, can I tell you this thing that happened, right? So just paying attention too to like, when does your kid feel comfortable, and trying to make sure you have more of those moments. And then I think really importantly, distinguishing between taking space to regulate emotions and timeouts for problem behavior. And these can look the same way, right? Because a kid gets really angry and is having really big feelings, and that's when they throw the toy. And of course, it's appropriate to take a time out when someone is, putting someone in physical harm, right? But you want to make sure it's a different thing. If you're seeing a kid get activated and you're seeing your kid get upset and you want them to take a minute and calm down, it should be in a different space and a different environment than when the behavior has already crossed a line, right? So taking space to like, you seem like you're really getting upset, or I notice you're having a hard time calming down your body, or even like, you're so excited right now that your body has a little bit too much energy. Why don't you take space? Should be a different thing than, hey, you just threw that at your brother's head, and now I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that, right? They're different things, and we want to make sure we're helping our kids understand that too. So in conclusion, I would say when Victoria and I sort of went through some of this talk last week, I think we had a conversation afterwards where she was saying like, yeah, the pandemic is going on and it feels kind of, I think you said maybe hopeless, but I remember thinking like, okay, I don't want to get I also don't want to give this talk and have it be like, hey, the pandemic's never going to end, so you better take care of your mental health. That's not what I mean to do, right? What I love about these little tools of mental health, what I think is so exciting is that there are small things we can do daily that give us a sense of power, that give us a sense of control, that give us a sense of connection, and that can happen. We can rely on those things even when the world around us feels completely out of control. And it doesn't make the world better. It doesn't solve all our problems. But when we start to realize that we have some control about creating pockets of safety and containment for ourselves and our loved ones, no matter what, I feel like that's an amazing kind of power. So that is a lot of information in a short amount of time. But I am happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to have people get in touch with me with thoughts or comments or questions at any point in the future. I actually really like talking about mental health.
Thanks so much, Tara.
Thank you.